housing, and other necessities. And there are two main types. So first is a nominal wage, which is when the federal government sets a fixed value. So they're like, okay, the wage will be like $25, and it kind of stays that way. The second is an indexed wage, which means they kind of do set a fixed wage in the beginning, but as the cost of living increases or fluctuates, or it may decrease as well, then the wage becomes adjusted in conjunction with the CPI. So basically it's tailored to increase or decrease inflation in order for workers to have a stable standard of living. So at Loyola this weekend, these are I think the 4 1ACs I saw. So the most common was the whole res AF, and there are 3 main scenarios. The first is inequality. The argument is that living wage would reduce income gaps because it obviously fiats that lower paid workers are paid more. There are cards that say that I think 75% of the increase in inequality is caused by stagnant wages, which the plan would reverse. The second scenario that was less common, but I think is the most strategic, is secular stagnation. It's very similar to an econ impact in terms of the plan says lower demand and lower productivity are bad, and the plan solves that because it increases productivity, which I think I'll explain more when I'm talking about AF answers to the econ dissad. And I think the second most common scenario on the whole res AF was different human rights scenarios. So there are 2 main variations. First is general worker rights credibility. There's this international organization called the International Labor Organization, or ILO, that's established to preserve worker rights. And there are multiple cards that say that in the preamble of the ILO, they say that adopting a living wage is necessary to protect those rights. So the plan would solve that. The second is just general US human rights credibility. The impact to this is obviously better, but the internal link cards are worse. A lot of international treaties, such as the ILO, IESCR, UDHR, have all said that a living wage for all workers is necessary to preserve, U.S. human rights credibility, and the plan would align us with those treaties. And there's good cards that say that in the context of living wage, other countries model American actions, and that it could spill over to broader credibility because it's a necessary enabling right. In my opinion, I think whole res AFs are more strategic for a few reasons. First is that the app has good straight turns to all dissads. So I think the most common ones, and definitely the most threatening ones, are inflation, unemployment, things like small businesses. Those would all be solved by the plan because the app would have arguments for why the plan increases productivity. Yeah, I was going to explain this on inflation, but I feel like it makes more sense to say it now. So I think there are 2 main arguments for productivity increases. The first is called the Webb effect, which says that when labor costs are higher, which the plan would obviously increase labor costs because it forces companies to pay their workers a higher wage, then instead of just hiring more workers to increase investment or increase output, companies are more incentivized to invest in new automated technology, which increases productivity. The second one is called efficiency wages theory, and there are 2 main components to this. So subpoint A would be gratefulness, which is when workers get a pay raise, they're inherently happier, their morale goes up, efficiency goes up, and those would cause productivity increases. And the better argument, I think, is just when wages go up, workers are inherently afraid that they're going to be fired because they know that companies' labor costs are now higher and that they may want to fire some workers. So in order to preempt possible firing, they're oh, I need to work harder so I don't get fired. And that increases productivity. And the reason for why productivity would solve things like inflation is the link to inflation is that when labor costs are higher, companies offset those labor costs by raising prices to maintain profits. But if their workers are now producing more and they have excess supply, if they have excess supply, then they actually lower prices because supply is currently outpacing demand post-plan. The second warrant for why I think whole res is better than other sector AFs is it's definitely better against advantage counterplans. So the AF has better reasons for why adopting a living wage is key. The third one, which ties into the second one, is I don't mean this in a mean way, but the internal links are actually real. So I saw some 1ACs, and I won't name them obviously, but like it's like I don't think they even have like a single card that substantiates plan would solve this impact. And also, I think a common thing that people think when they're cutting sector-specific apps is that like disads will be smaller. Like obviously, yes, disads will be smaller if the plan is smaller. But if the case is 0, then literally a 1% risk of a disad would outweigh. So I think it's still more strategic. The second most common AF I saw was healthcare. And there are 3 main scenarios. The first is pandemics. Like the plan would increase the quality of care. It would increase the amount of people who want to become doctors. And that allows for things like higher quality of care, as well as I think the DDF says like better monitoring against pandemics. Like more people want to be specialized disease physicians to like research vaccine development. The second internal link this app has is economic decline. So again, not really clear what the internal link to this was, but it's pretty sure it's like labor shortages of doctors hurt economies for some reason, and that spills over. And the third is food insecurity, which is just lack of access to stable care would also be bad for growing food. The third most common F I saw was agriculture, so pay farm workers a higher wage. And the internal links, okay, the impacts are the same. The internal links are slightly different. The internal link to pandemics was like, yeah, I'm so sorry. I honestly don't even know, but I know the next two. So the internal link to economic decline is when there are labor shortages in the farming industry, that has outsized effects on the general economy, because as farming production decreases and the US becomes weakened, then that spills over to affect other sectors as well. And the most real internal link is obviously food insecurity. So as they have a reason, the app has a reason for why the farming industry is on the brink of collapse now because of labor shortages. Less people want to be farmers, and that would cause decreases in production, which hurts, food aid to developing countries as well as food security in the US. The fourth F is public school teachers. So they have 3 main scenarios. First is hedge and pandemics. The internal link to this is STEM education. So like if less people want to be teachers and the quality of teaching decreases, like people aren't taught as well in schools, and that means they can't really go on to produce, new military tech, new inventions that would hedge against pandemics. The third is democracy, which is like lack of quality teaching hurts democracy and means like kids are less likely to have an understanding of how government institutions work. In my opinion, sector apps are generally less strategic for a few reasons. One, like I said, like the case is very, very small. Like the internal link is like swamped by so many all causes. 2 is like advantage counterplans. I think in most cases would solve the app more than the app does. So this is on like 2 levels. Like one, like in terms of internal links, for example, with the healthcare app, I was recutting some of the solvency advocates. And one of the app internal links is like people don't want to become doctors, right? And their authors all of the time would be like, here's steps we should take for people to want to be doctors more. And oftentimes those were not like increased wages. It was like, increase like subsidized medical education, subsidized physician like vacation time so that they're not burned out, things like that. So those are all things from 1AC solvency advocates that would solve the case. 2 is like on the level of the terminal impact alone, you can kind of like fiat the F internal link without the living wage, in terms of like if the plan says research, like increasing the amount of people who want to become doctors is key to research that like means vaccine development against pandemics. You can fiat like the establishment of like epidemic management systems. You can fiat the Fed like funds more R&D, funds R&D and things like vaccines, therapies, other things that would also solve the impact. 3 is, I think the thing that's like worst for the sector apps is like, in my opinion, they link equally to inflation. Like obviously the plan will be like we're only in one sector, so it won't spill over across the economy, but I don't think that's true or a good argument, which I'll explain more on like when I'm talking about the inflation to set against sector specific apps. Impact turns are probably intuitive. Most apps have growth scenarios, so growth bad. DDEV was obviously a huge component at Loyola. Most apps also have hedge impacts just because this ties in with all of the economic decline stuff. I read an SDGs impact. I think I was the only person that did, but the argument was like living wage is a very important condition of achieving SDGs because it would directly enable things like no poverty, reduced inequality, access to safe, sufficient food, partnerships, like to form global cooperation against threats. And yeah, so SDGs bad probably isn't as relevant, but the scenarios were like water privatization, it results in industrial ag because the goal of no hunger would mean we have to increase monocultures. Disease good, human rights leadership bad, obviously. I don't think either of the last two are really good arguments, but they were like read pretty common often. Now, generally topicality arguments, there was only one at Loyola, but I think there was a second one that I cut that wasn't very strategic, but like I still cut it anyways. So the first and the real argument is obviously T-subsets. There are multiple organizations, including like these international organizations like the UN Global Compact, the ILO, that are like living wage benchmarks must apply to all workers regardless of sector, which means the plan cannot specify like only farm workers or only healthcare workers receive a living wage. Limits and grounds arguments are pretty compelling, I think, especially limits because there are just so many sectors that the plan could apply to. And I think it's generally true that like, well, I personally think inflation does link a lot to sector Fs. I think most judges believe like the narrative of like, how can we read any dissat about like small businesses or like inflation against like plan give sewage workers a living wage. The second argument is that the living wage must be indexed. So I think I was talking about this on the first page. The interp card I cut for this is like the line I have quoted here. That's like, in the past, living wage laws in local cities, the legislature was like, you have to adjust the wages in conjunction with changes to the CPI. So based off of increasing or decreasing inflation. Okay, counterplans. First is the state's counterplan. I think this was in most 1 and Cs. And there are two main solvency arguments. First is empiric. So I think right now 29 states have a local living wage that's higher than the federal wage, and like they're increasing it on their own. Like they're tailoring these policies based off of worker demands. The second and I think more compelling one is that one size fits all policies are bad. So there are multiple cards that say that setting like a general living wage across the nation would not be good because, you know, if I'm living in California, my cost of living is obviously going to be higher than someone who's living in like Idaho. So if the federal government tries to average like, oh, what living wage would apply across the nation, it'll be too high for some areas, causing businesses to go bankrupt, or it'll be too low, so it wouldn't solve inequality. I think the AF argument against like, well, generally, I don't think states is a great argument because the only net benefit is elections, which the F straight turns. But in terms of the solvency argument, this is just like a random thought, but I'm pretty sure normal means of the plan would be states. Like Fed is like the states have to set a wage, and then the states would like do it accordingly, which solves the whole one size fits all bad. The second and more common thing was advantage counterplans. So generally to solve things like inequality, things like a negative income tax that would redistribute wealth throughout the economy, increase education. There's good cards that are like education is the root cause of inequality, and providing means for more people to gain access to education allows them to buy things like housing and like indirectly increases their income. The second is to solve pandemics, things like funding vaccine development, increasing surveillance systems or disease detection systems. The third one, this isn't like an app scenario necessarily, but so many apps for reading like recession inevitable warrants. I think the most common one was like the break app that was like, they read the Zolik card that says recession is inevitable because things like 9/11, Eurozone, 08 all prove. And then Zolik later on goes on to say we should do things like funding the World Health Organization, climate investment funds, and we should also establish like an international forum to monitor economic shocks so we know how to better prepare against those catastrophes. So if you really want to go for like an econ dissad, which most people probably do, I think including a counterplan like that in the 1 and C to solve all of these recession inevitable warrants would be good. And then the last thing is like human rights. This is pretty intuitive. Like you fiat, the Fed complies with other rights that are obviously bad for US credibility. So doing things like decriminalizing whistleblowing, ending religious persecution, and more. I don't think many people read these at all, which I wasn't really expecting, but they're obviously against whole res apps. You can read lots of different picks. And the disads, like the net benefits to the picks would be the disads you reach as sector apps. So if you have a disad that's like high healthcare prices bad, then you could read counterplan, do the plan, except like don't raise wages or like don't grant a living wage to healthcare workers, and then read like why granting a living wage to healthcare workers would be bad for prices. So obviously the like healthcare and the agriculture prices stuff would be more real. I don't really know if there's like a disad to like giving public school teachers a higher wage. That's not just inflation anyways. And then the fourth one was process counterplans. Obviously the generic ones like sunsets, core curbing were read. But I think the more like topic specific ones were things like the ILO counterplan, the IESCR counterplan. So generally because living wage is inherent in so many international treaties, the NEG has reasons for why if we adopt a living wage under, and then say it's like because of our CIL or obligations, or say it's because we're recommitting to institutions like the UN, then that would revitalize the credibility of those organizations. And this is another reason why I think whole res apps are more strategic, because if you read whole res, you have a very, very, not strong link to human rights, but like you have a relatively strong internal link to human rights. And then if they read a process counterplan that's specific to a certain organization, you can say that the plan solves the impact, because the 1AC evidence says like adopting a living wage in and of itself is sufficient to revitalize compliance with those organizations. Okay, now the disads, obviously there aren't many. I think there are like, and econ was obviously the biggest one with 3 variants. First is inflation, second is small businesses, and third was unemployment. Then you have elections, and like there are like 2 types. So the first is general elections, which is literally like plan unpopular. I think there's only one card that like says the plan would be unpopular. It's this card that's like, the plan seems popular in the abstract in polls, but when people think about the economic impacts of a living wage, like higher prices or unemployment, support would drop to like 37%. The second and most strategic version of this, I think, is just reading perception links, which most teams have been doing. It's like you can win, the plan is very popular in the abstract, but this certain group or this certain swing states perceives the plan as increasing inflation, and that flips the election. And then people were reading Farm Bill. I don't think permitting was read, but politics is just like the bill won't pass. Like it's like because the elections are coming, Congress won't do anything until after November. So probably mostly irrelevant. Okay, I'm going to talk a lot about inflation because I spent the most time researching this, and I also think it's the only real neg argument on the topic. So there are 2 types of inflation. First is cost push inflation, which is when higher costs of production, i.e. higher costs of labor because workers' wages have now gone up, that causes companies to raise prices. Because, at its core, all companies want to make a profit, right? If suddenly they have to pay all of their workers more in order to compensate for that increase in cost of labor and cost of production, then they raise their prices. The second is demand pull inflation. Like obviously, if you have low supply but high demand, then prices go up. I think this card, I think it's the Dervishi card that I have in the doc. It says this, like these 2 things in the same card. I know it's really under highlighted, but it's like increasing demand, but increases prices, and increasing wages increases labor costs, which means that companies will reduce employees, which 1, reduces production, or 2, they will raise prices. So the neg's internal link to inflation is this thesis of a wage price spiral, which is when wages go up, inflation goes up. And when inflation goes up, all of these workers are like you paid me a few dollars more, but now since prices have gone up, like I'm making like basically as much as I was making before, or I was making less than I was making before. And then they get really angry, right? Because all of their money is losing its value. And that forces companies or the government to raise prices again. And then raise wages again. And then because of that increase in wages, prices go up again, and that creates a spiraling effect. So there are two main internal links. The first is worker demands, which I think was mostly explained. The second one that I don't think most 1Rs answer and that 2Rs should point out more is politicians. Like when so many workers are like backlashing because they're like, I'm making less money than I was before. Like you've literally hurt me. Then in order to preserve their popularity, like they don't really care about what the economic effects are going to be. Like as long as they preserve their popularity, in order to like pacify all of these worker demands, they will raise wages and make it like mandatory across the nation. The two main impacts to inflation, first is defense spending. So as money loses its value, the Pentagon has less to spend on, they have the same amount of money to spend, but their money is worth less value. So defense spending goes down, and that means that revisionist powers like Russia, China, Iran will all attempt to attack the U.S. in geopolitical hotspots because it's perceived as like American retrenchment. Second is like fiscal miscalibration. I think I'm going to explain this on like the rate hikes just said instead of here. So, okay. I think the inflation links that every 1NC should read against HORES. Oh wait, first as a note, I think most 1NCs should, I think the most strategic thing to do on this topic is to just read like 20 cards on inflation in the 1NC. Like obviously you should make other arguments, like read a states counterplan, read a process counterplan, like maybe read like advantage counterplan elections. But like this is the only actual argument that's like ever true on this topic. And like obviously technical debating outweighs everything else, but this is like truer arguments are just easier to win. So I think links against HORES, first is labor costs, and then which was like above, I guess. Second is like monetary supply. This is basically the same thing as like demand pull inflation, but the argument is like it's basically just inequality good. The card is like when high income workers tend to invest in things like financial assets, which fosters economic stability, but low income or like middle income workers that the plan would affect, like it would cause them to increase their purchasing on common goods, things such as, food, water, necessities. They would increase spending on that, and that causes inflation. The third is I think everyone in C should have not just the explanation of why a plan causes inflation, but statistics that are like, a 10% increase in the minimum wage would increase prices by like 2.04%, would increase prices by 1.5%. All of these things are important because the 1R will most certainly read defense. It is like the inflation effect is like statistically insignificant. Maybe it's like only 0.3%. Fourth is, I don't think this is necessary to include in the 1NC, but I think if you're debating someone good, I think you should include it. So the argument that a one-time hike would link to the net benefit, this is not net benefit. I didn't get much sleep. One-time hike would link to the disad because the AF cards that say the wage price spiral thesis is wrong are very good. So if you have reasons for why, even if the plan does not result in a spiral, a one-time hike is sufficient to like trigger the impact. And the way you do this is either re-highlight a 1AC solvency advocate that says we would increase living wage to like X amount of dollars, or you should cut either a study from MIT like living wage calculator or the ILO that says normal means is most likely raising the living wage to like $25.02, I think. And then there's this like online thing that's like raising 69 million people are currently making less than 25 an hour. So even if the plan does not result in a spiral, it would still impact 70 million workers, which is still a lot. Now, inflation links against sector specific. First is spillover in the context of the link. So even if the plan only fiats, like one group of workers receive a living wage, other workers will demand for wage increases as well. So the King card is the best card on this. It's like once one group of workers achieve an inflation busting pay increase, others wanted to follow suit. And like other groups of workers will be angry, they'll protest, and they'll negotiate with their employers or the government in order to receive a living wage as well. Like if I'm a healthcare worker and I see farm workers, like now they get 25 an hour, like why don't I also get 25 an hour? And then they will protest. Second is worker retention. I think this is the best argument the NEG has, which is like, let's say Fed says, okay, tomorrow all farm workers will receive a pay increase of X amount. Now their wage is $25. If I'm making less than $25 and maybe I'm working as like a fast food worker, like what incentive do I have? Obviously, I'm going to be like, well, I think I'm going to be a farm worker instead because now my employer has to pay me $25 and I'll be making so much more than I am working at like McDonald's. So this card that I've attached is like other employers would have to raise wages quickly to retain their employees. Otherwise, literally any other sector that is making less than 25 an hour or less than whatever the plan sets the new wage to be in a certain sector, they all run to that sector. So I'll go to the ag industry, healthcare workers will go to the ag industry. Everyone just flies to the ag industry to be a farmer because now they're making more money. And then when employers are like, all my workers are gone, like, now what do I do? Then they have to raise wages. So like, come back, like we're also going to raise our wage to 25 an hour. And that causes a spiral across the economy. The third is spillover in the context of the impact. So if you cut links that are like, still using the ag-af as an example, if you cut links that say that raising wages in the agriculture industry would increase food prices, then you can read a card that says increasing food prices increases inflation generally because food prices are important in the cost of living, which this card says. It doesn't really have a warrant, but like I'm sure there are better cards out there. The third and most important thing is to use when I say cross-ex strategically. So, well, this is true for two reasons. First is that most of these sector apps have econ internal links. Like they're reading cards for you. Okay, still using ag-af as an example. They're reading cards for you that are like unemployment in agriculture or disruptions in the food industry would cascade across the economy. I think one of the ag-afs has a line that's like other industries are intertwined with and dependent on the food industry. So if you're in one of these classes, it's like, just to be clear, like any disruption in the food industry cascades across the economy, right? Like the F has to say yes, because it's what their evidence says, it's what their internal link says. And then you would only need to when the plan increases food prices for that to cause general inflation. The second thing is, I think this is the better thing to do, is the internal link to every one of these apps is currently there are shortages in this sector. So still using the ag app, they're like farmers, people don't want to be farmers right now. And their entire solvency argument and every internal link they have is plan makes more people want to be farmers. And you should ask about this in cross-ex. Like you can either make this very explicit if your judge is dumb, or you can make it like less explicit if like your judge is going to understand like this is like what they're trying to say. So you can be like so the plan makes it more desirable for other workers or like for normal people to come work in the farm industry, right? And then they'll say yes. And that is like this kind of second link that I was talking about. That's like people in other sectors will immediately rush into the agriculture sector because now it's more profitable. The whole point is because profit increases, other people want to work in this sector. Okay, now there's the rate hikes to sad. This is this is like the same thing as inflation, but there's two main differences. First is it has a perception link. So not only do they have a card that's like inflation would cause the Fed to raise rates, or it would cause, or that the Fed doesn't like wage growth. There's cards that are like federal expectations of inflation are all that matter. And they think that wage growth is inflationary. So it does not matter. Like if the F wins, like we don't actually result in inflation. Like it doesn't matter because the Fed will mistakenly believe that it will. And then they'll raise rates accordingly. Second is, this is arguable, but the NEG probably doesn't need to win a wage price spiral. They only need to win the plan causes a short-term increase in prices. Okay, when you're going for inflation, you should emphasize a few things. First is most of the AF cards are like, okay, this is true of the NEG cards too, but most of the AF cards are like, oh, like, the effect is, the inflationary effect is insignificant because a 10% increase in the minimum wage would only increase inflation by like 0.3%, and people don't care about that. Like, you should be like, yes, maybe, but like the plan is not a 10% increase in the minimum wage. Like, if you win, that normal means is $25, which I'm sure most apps defend. I think most apps are defending like $26 or more. That's over a 250% increase in the current wage. So even if it's like, maybe a 10% minimum wage would only increase prices 0.3%, it's actually 0.3 times 20 something. And then obviously the neg will have cards that are like, the effect isn't 0.3%, it's actually 2%, it's more. Second is, you should say that AF authors do not assume the indirect effects of a wage increase. So this card, I think, is good at parsing the distinction between the two. It's like, once the wholesale shock is accounted for, pass-through to prices doubles to 2.04%. So it's not just like, what is the direct effect, but like other things that companies will do that would raise prices. Two is, you should definitely say turns case. I think this is intuitive. Most apps have inequality scenarios. They have reasons. Like, every app internal link is premised off of increasing purchasing power of this group of workers is good. If you win inflation, the plan does not increase purchasing power because their money is worth less. Like, even if they're being paid more, like, their money has less value because prices have gone up. So they still are unable to buy like basic necessities. Third is, you should emphasize uniqueness. This argument probably isn't great, but I think most judges would probably like it. I'm not sure. I'm not a judge, but like, the argument, like, inflation is at like a great state right now. It's decreasing, especially according to the Fed's preferred measures. And in his speech, is he the director of the Federal Reserve? I don't know what like his official title is. Like, I'm blanking, but Powell was like, at his speech, he was like, we're going to do rate cuts in probably September because inflation is cooling and across like all metrics, the economy is strong. But if inflation suddenly spikes, then we can't do rate cuts. So you should say at the top of the twin R, like near the top, like, if the app doesn't read inflation high now, because there's probably not a card that says that, you should say like, inflation is fine now, official statements prove. So literally any risk of a link like outweighs, because the economy is fine now, so there's only a risk the plan makes it worse. Fourth is, this is very, very important. If the 1AR drops the perception link, like, you should definitely go for it. And then the way you should explain this is like, perception over reality, because even if they win every single reason for why the plan does not actually result in inflation, the Fed thinks it will, and businesses think it will, and that's all we need to win, because like, that thought alone causes the Fed to raise rates, which is existential, and it causes businesses to preemptively raise prices, which results in inflation anyways. I realized I forgot to explain the fiscal miscalibration impact that I said I was going to explain on rate hikes. So the argument is that right now the economy is uniquely fragile, and if unexpected basically policies that cause inflation come, and the Fed does not like predict these things, because obviously they can't predict the planned fiat would be immediate, then that causes them to overreact or like react wrongly and then raise rates incorrectly. And that type of raising rates incorrectly is sufficient to like push the economy basically over the tipping point. It's basically an economic decline impact. But I think that the most common one that people are reading, the Wishart card, it doesn't just say like economic decline causes war. It's like economic decline erodes resilience and our capacity to respond to existential threats. So things like, cyber attacks, misaligned AI, biodiversity collapse, all of those like would be caused by economic decline. Okay, back to like things you should emphasize when going for the inflation dissent. Fifth, and I think you should emphasize the difference between like something like you should be like, most 1ARs like don't understand what a link turn is, right? Like, if you're reading inflation, if the AF link turns your impact, that means they're winning the plan reduces inflation. If they're like, we increase government spending, or they have cards that are like, we add 7 trillion to the economy, or they're like, we would do something that's good for workers. Like, that's all fine, like, but who cares? Like, we read a dissent about inflation. Like, no one cares if you how much money you add to the economy, or like how much more optimistic you make businesses, because that doesn't solve the inflation link. Prices will still be high. So like, I think lots of teams are reading like I said, plan would add money to the economy, which like first like that does, like it honestly doesn't matter. Maybe the US like profits more, like businesses get more money, but like that doesn't mean they won't raise prices. Sixth is you should emphasize the scope of the AF studies versus the like literal what the AF literally does. So first is lots of the cards are like in this. Oh, lots of the AF cards are sector specific. For example, they'll be like, if we adopted a living wage in the fast food restaurant like sector, then that would not be inflationary. Like yeah, but plan is not just fast food restaurants, it's across the economy. Like it's an economy-wide living wage, which none of their evidence assumes. Two is like scope literally, like lots of cards are like, or like the empirics cards are like, in a few cities this thing was successful, which obviously does not assume that the plan is an economy-wide policy. Okay, I think answering Common App arguments, first answering the productivity link turn. When I'm explaining how the app should explain the productivity link turn, it'll make more sense. But first you should say like time frame, even if it causes businesses to like invest in new tech or it causes workers to increase productivity, that does not matter because our link is about immediate increases in prices, and productivity might solve that like in the long run, but currently demand would outpace supply. Two is like there are some studies that say it's wrong. I think Hill 18 and Peterson 22 are the only ones though. So yeah, the F is kind of outcarding the neg, but whatever. Second is lots and lots of teams are saying recession inevitable. So again, like one, time frame, even if like in a few decades, the economy might collapse because of like a cyber attack that causes financial markets to be disrupted. Like we have a short-term scenario for extinction, like now, because the plan would raise prices immediately. Two, you should say that none of the AV cards are definitive. Like they might say like the economy is fragile or that we're on the brink of economic collapse, but that is the next argument because it means that any increase in inflation or any miscalibration by the Fed would cause extinction. Third, you should say like, okay, this is obviously a fake argument, but you should say like inflation is distinct from general economic conditions, because even if economic collapse is inevitable, inflation impact is not, it's about defense spending, which is not the same thing. The third thing is no wage price spiral. So you should obviously read cards to answer this, starting from the 1 and C, and then again, you should say the one-time hike links. Now, there's the elections to set. I don't think it's strategic because the link is factually about inflation and the plan's economic effects. So if AF wins, we are not inflationary or we do not hurt the economy, it takes it out. The common impacts are like one, climate change, and then two, foreign policy. So either Trump withdraws from NATO or there's this other card that's like he would just retrench globally, like reduce presence in the Middle East. He would strike Iran and do lots of aggressive things that would harm regional stability and result in power vacuums. I think the best version of elections is perception links coupled with specific links. And what I mean by this is two things. First is some teams were reading swing state dissets. Like I know debate drills had a Michigan dissent that I thought was pretty smart. So it's like, it's not just, it's still elections, obviously, but it's like Michigan voters hate the plan. Then they read Michigan as a swing state and like they have uniqueness that's like Harris wins in Michigan now and like all of that. So I'm guessing their strategy would have been like if the 1AR just reads their general like 70-something% support a living wage, so like that might be true broadly, but it's not true in Michigan, and like dropped Michigan as the key swing state. So like whatever. Second is other people, I think Harvard Westlake were reading like certain groups of voter dissents is what I call them. So the one Harvard Westlake read was small businesses perceive the plan as being bad for them. Like they cited a poll that's like 74% of small businesses fear a living wage. And then they read small businesses are the swing voters in the election. So obviously then the app can't read like our generic living wage popular cards because they'll be like irrelevant. You dropped small businesses key to the election and that the plan is unpopular among small businesses specifically, which is like all that matters. Again, like perception links obviously very, very good because It's not about whether or not the plan would actually like harm things like inflation, small businesses, but whether or not those small businesses would think the plan harms them, which the NEG has cards that, they would. So I didn't really look into any Ks, but I'm guessing the cap K link is like pretty good again, especially against the inequality impacts that are like institutional collapse because of lack of trust in institutions. So in a reductionist sense, it's stay homeless so you stay mad. So living wage like makes people happy, they like the government more, and that makes them less likely to protest against, capitalist systems of domination. Strategic things to do generally, just not in the context of this topic, like not in the context of this topic broadly. Like one, root cause on this topic I think is very, very good because most apps are like, the only advantage is inequality, and like obviously capitalism causes inequality. Two, I don't know if this is actually something that's possible, but I was just thinking of it. I think if the NEG concedes like recession inevitable, because lots of the AF cards are like unpredictable shocks in the economy are inevitable. So like systemic collapse is inevitable. Then the NEG can read that as like we'll concede that, which means it's like an unsustainability warrant for why growth will like eventually collapse at some point. Three is like alt solves a case, which is pretty much the same thing as the root cause thing. Against inflation, which I think is the only threatening argument to the AF, a few things. First is the productivity link turn. I was like really surprised more teams weren't reading this, because I thought it was very clear in my mind. There are only two NEG studies that answer the productivity link turn, and neither of them, only one of them is good. So there are two subpoints. I know I explained this above, but again, automation, it causes businesses to invest in new efficient technology, and gratefulness and fears of unemployment motivate workers to do more. Two is lots of apps are saying recession inevitable. I think the better thing to say is inflation inevitable because of this thing called greedflation, which is where corporations artificially raise their prices. And they're like, oh, it's just because of wage increases, but it's like actually not. It's just because corporations want profit, obviously. Three is, like I said, the no wage price for all cards are very, very good. The first component of this is like labor costs are irrelevant. I think there's a card that's like most goods are imported. So even if like the cost of domestic labor costs increase, it doesn't matter because most goods are like shipped to the US overseas. Second is like there are cards that are like the IMF analyzed a database of all wage spirals and concluded that in the vast majority of cases, inflation was not sustained. Also, the next best argument for wage price fall is like the 70s prove, because I think it was like wages increased like 117%, if I'm correct. And then there's this card that's like the 70s wage price spiral was caused by increasing oil shocks, not wages. For AF arguments against counterplans, the first thing I think that's like generally true is just leadership internal links are very good. What I mean by this is things about international perception. So the SDGs impact and the human rights impact or other impacts about recommitting to the international order. I think this is good for two reasons. First is against the state's counterplan. Lots of these organizations have come out and said, like, we think that national legal standards are key. Also, like you can say that only the federal government has the legal authority to like recommit or like ratify certain tenets of these treaties. Second thing is, like I said, it would solve the impact to lots of the process counterplans about like recommitting to CIL, recommitting to ILO, because the plan would do that as well. Two is you should say that most advantage counterplans link to the net benefit. The thing my coach says is like the inflation dissent is just inequality good. So if the counterplan solves inequality, then it links. And like, so in the context of, I think I said the increased education solves inequality. The argument for why increased education would solve inequality is because if people are getting more educated, they get higher incomes and then they can buy like more houses because that's how it works. But like the more important part is like if you have higher levels of education, you're more likely to get a better paying job. So that means your like wages have gone up. So that would obviously link. Against inflation. Oh wait, sorry. I guess the slides got out of order. Like back to AF against inflation. I think internal link defense is like really, really good, and like more teams should be reading it. So the first thing in terms of the military spending internal link, you should say that most of the Pentagon's contracts, they're like fixed price, which means inflation doesn't matter because they already have like set prices that won't change. Second, you should obviously read cards that are like rate hikes not bad for the economy. Okay, wait. I think the cards for the military spending internal link defense are much better than like the rate hikes internal link defense, because rate hikes are like definitely bad for the economy. So maybe against rate hikes, read like econ defense, but against the military spending impact, read internal link defense. So the common arguments at Loyola for like against inflation were like, one, recession inevitable because of black swans. Two is like lots of teams were reading like plan increases middle class power. That means we're resilient against economic shocks. Yeah, that didn't really make sense to me. Econ obviously would turn inequality, and inequality is very long term. Probably plan can't solve most of it, so probably relevant. When you're up against inflation, things you cannot drop is one, turns case, especially because it's like very, very intuitive to say that if the plan, like living, like if the neg wins a link to inflation, that would turn solvency because money has less purchasing power. Two is you cannot drop perception links. Like you can answer these very quickly. The thing I do if I'm like time crunched is like either just say Fed is not stupid or say overcorrection has no impact. The thing I attached below is like if rates are raised imprecisely, they can be dropped again immediately, which means if the Fed raises rates and they're like, whoops, plan actually didn't result in inflation, then they would obviously do rate cuts. Against econ disads, against unemployment, obviously unemployment high now. You should say that increased spending, there's cards that increased spending solves because even if some workers get fired, like the vast majority will retain their jobs and those workers will be spending more, and that increased spending causes more jobs to be created because demand has increased. You should also say empirically disproven. There's like lots of cards that are like hundreds of studies show there's zero effect on employment. Small businesses thing, they're low. Actually, I don't know if they're actually low now. I have a card that says they're low now, but I don't know if it's true. You should say the plan is good for them because reduced turnover and productivity increases saved costs. So basically the same link turns as against inflation. Oh, by the way, all of the like reduced turnover and plan increases productivity warrants also apply to unemployment because if workers are producing more, companies no longer need to like offset labor costs by increasing prices or firing workers. And then last thing, you can just say this analytically, but like other barriers to entry, things like networks or like consumer trust and loyalty, like even if a new business comes up with like something similar to like Apple's products, like one, they would probably get sued for like violating certain patents, but like two, you would probably stick with Apple just because brand loyalty. Against elections, things you can't drop. One, don't drop perception, like obviously. Two is, like I said, you can't read generic plan popular cards against specific disads. So if they read the Michigan disad that's like plan unpopular in Michigan, Michigan swings election. Like if you only read plan generally popular and then you drop Michigan as the key swing state and the plan is unpopular there, then you're going to lose. Lots of teams are saying Trump rolls back the plan. Obviously a fake argument. Just say fiat solves. It must be durable. Otherwise, every app loses like next administration overturns plan. Against sector-specific disads, all of the productivity link turns apply. And I think impact defense takes most of these out because the only actual sector disads or picks that exist, I think, are like healthcare, like causes disease. Disease impact probably fake. And then, like pick out of farm workers with like food impact attached, like food scarcity probably does pacify conflict, but obviously don't double turn yourself. You should say productivity linked turns the impact. Don't say productivity linked turn and food insecurity solves for. The last thing is just common misunderstandings that I saw. I guess there's mostly one that was like kind of like frustrating, I know, to like me and to some judges. Like never, ever, ever read inflation, unemployment, or internal link defense in the same 1C. What I mean by this is I know some teams were reading plan causes inflation and plan causes unemployment. The Phillips curve is like I would say it's like a generally accepted economic theory that's like higher inflation equals lower unemployment. It also just makes logical sense, right? The next argument for why the plan would result in like either of these impacts is higher labor costs mean businesses offset those costs by doing X. If businesses offset those costs by raising prices, they no longer need to fire workers. If they offset those higher prices by firing workers, they no longer need to raise prices because then their labor costs would be the same as they were before. Also, another thing, do not read like, when I say don't read internal link defense in inflation, I mean don't read like the things that are like the 6 point that's like, oh, businesses will invest in automated tech instead. And like one, that's the ass argument, and like two, like, I mean, impact to that is like nothing. And then don't read like businesses will cut hours or they will reduce like things like non-wage compensation, like vacation time. Like if businesses do all of those things to like offset higher labor costs, then the plan no longer results in inflation. And the F is like concede that. So like no impact to inflation. And like that's the only threatening argument. So it also looks bad because it looks like because most judges understand like the Phillips curve stuff. So if you say these contradictory arguments, then like it looks like you don't have an understanding of the economy. Okay, that was most of what I had. If anyone has any questions, let me know.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you ran into any traditional arguments at Loyola. I mean, I assume not, just because I know it's a pretty progressive field. But I was wondering, in terms of traditional arguments, I mean, I assume it's probably like the same thing in terms of what you mentioned. But what are some common traditional arguments that you assume might be ran more often throughout the rest of the September, October tournaments, or have you already seen any trad arguments in terms of either F or neg?
Yeah, in terms of trad arguments, I would assume just the econ dissent will be prevalent. I feel like unemployment might be more common as a trad argument than inflation. Just because unemployment just seems like it has a better like turns case argument, because if the plan results in more people being fired, then they can't solve inequality. And it just seems like a more like a more like easier thing to explain, I think. Like I don't think okay, wait. The honest answer is like vibes makes me think unemployment is more common in trad than inflation will be. But like yeah, sorry. I know that's not really a good answer, but just generally forms of econ dissets I think will be very common.
No, yeah, that helped. Thank you.
Also, sorry, this. Oh, okay. I think the link to CAP, I'm guessing is mostly just like, well, first is lots of 1ACs will say preempts to econ. They'll say like plan increases growth, plan increases productivity. And obviously that alone isn't like a link to CAP, but I'm sure the neg has links that are like increased productivity, and like investments in like always increasing efficiency will be bad for is capitalist. Also, the thing I explained above, that's like stay homeless, stay mad. Basically, when workers are like treated unfairly, they're like not receiving enough pay and they're like angry at the government, they're more likely to revolt against systems of domination. But if they're like, oh, the government did nice things, like we like them now, like they're less likely to protest systems of domination, which makes them more complicit in structures of domination. Yeah, the argument for increased spending answers unemployment is basically, well, okay, the card for this that I have is not very good, but the card is like, even if a few workers, like let's say 5% of workers get fired, the rest of the workers, the rest 95% will still be making more than they were making in the past, right? And when they're making more in the past, they spend more on the economy. And when they're spending more, that increases demand, which means that companies need to hire more workers again in order to produce more supply to like meet increased demand, if that makes sense. I can also, if you email me, I can put my email. Wait, hold on. That's my email, and then that's my Insta. So if you have more questions or you want if you want me to send you the card that says increased spending solves unemployment, I can definitely send that over. And sorry, the slides were just a few small notes to myself, so most of what I said isn't on there. So if you need me to re-explain anything, just let me know. Yeah.
If anybody else has any more questions for Iva, probably email her or DM the WIN Instagram account because the meeting is literally going to end in like a minute. So, thank you, Iva, for doing this. And I think that
No problem.
generally concludes this topic lecture. And thank you to everybody who attended. This meeting is recorded and it'll probably be posted on YouTube.
All right. Thank you. Bye.